Welcome to The Standard in Vancouver. I'm Randall Mark. Tonight, the question about who was really behind the events of 9/11 continues to mount. The controversy around the events of 9/11 continues to gather steam. Although immediately dismissed by some, there are legitimate questions that have never quite been answered. Joining me to discuss some of these questions is Richard Gage. He's the founder of Architects and Engineers for 9/11Truth. Welcome to the show.
Thanks. It's great to be here.
Got lots of show and tell here. We'll get into that in a little bit. We've got lots of time to really get into the issues. But let's start with this. You're an architect, and how did you first get involved in trying to challenge the traditional idea of what happened at 9/11? How did you first get interested in this?
Well, first of all, I've been an architect for 20 years, worked on numerous different types of buildings, including steel-framed, fireproofed buildings. I was on my way to a construction site observation, and I heard on the radio 2 years ago the disturbing conclusions of a rather reluctant 9/11 researcher, David Ray Griffin.
Okay.
And this started me on a path that I changed my life.
Like a religious experience almost.
Yeah, I had never heard of an alternate theory to the World Trade Center collapses before. The official theory tells us that the planes entered these buildings, and shortly thereafter, due to fire, the structure was weakened and the building collapsed in a gravitational collapse down to the ground. Well, that's not what Dr. Griffin was talking about. He quoted 118 firefighters, for instance, who were talking about sounds of explosions, flashes of light, explosions visible around the buildings.
On the bottom.
At the top, where the jet plane
Okay,
impacts,
okay,
at the onset of the destruction of the Twin Towers. He
So
talked
these
about
are explosions that happened before the plane hit? Is that what they're claiming? Is that the claim?
No. Although there are there's some evidence to actually support that as well.
Oh, okay.
We stick with the main event of the collapse of these buildings. So that I'm a Reagan Republican. I have this was quite a
So you're not
change
like
of
a
events.
Democrat trying to, I'm going to hate on with Bush or something like that.
No.
Okay, so that's how you first, a couple of years ago, you got interested in this. You heard some theories. You said, this doesn't line up with what I've been told for all these years. Let's step back, and without getting into all the cards yet, but what for you is the most powerful evidence that you said, my goodness, the traditional arguments are not true? What was the most convincing one?
It adds up. I would have to say it's the tons of molten metal, though, found by the iron workers, the first responders, flowing like lava, they said, in the basements of all three World Trade Center towers.
The number 7, Tower 7, is that the one you were?
Yeah, the one that hardly anybody knows about because it hasn't received any play on the media. 47-story skyscraper collapses in about 6.5 seconds into its own footprint. And we're told
it wasn't hit by a plane.
Correct.
But they say it was hit by these massive pieces of debris, tons of metal that hit the sides of them. That weakened the structure.
Yeah, it did.
There's pictures that seem to show that.
Indeed. NIST, well, no, actually there's not. There's the facade is clouded with smoke on the south side where we're told all this damage was. Nevertheless, NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, they suggest that this damage was not a consequent factor in the collapse. They call this collapse due to normal office fires in their December 18th update. And we had an opportunity to present the evidence that we're going to be talking about today in that meeting. It's now a part of the official record.
So this molten metal, that's the problem for you. Why is that a problem?
Well, tons of it. Seen by the World Trade Center structural engineer, Leslie Robertson. He says as of 21 days after the attack, molten steel was still flowing. Astani, another structural engineer who had unfettered access to the ground zero, suggests that he saw melting of girders. In fact, he took photos of these, and we have them in our website, AE911Truth.org.
And why is that a problem? Why is the melting of the girders problematic for you?
Well, because the official story says these are normal office fires. Normal office fires only get to be about 900, 1,200 degrees. Right. Maybe 1,400 degrees under very, very ideal fuel-air mixture ratios. Guess what? Steel doesn't begin to melt until about 2,700 degrees, almost 3 times what we anticipate the temperatures of these fires were. That's Fahrenheit, 2,700 degrees
jet fuel?
Fahrenheit.
Couldn't it heated up the girders on impact to be hot enough to melt?
The jet fuel is a hydrocarbon. It doesn't burn any hotter than desks, carpeting, chairs, 1,400 degrees. It was a spectacular blast. Most of it burned up outside. The rest of it was gone in 10 minutes. So we have fairly normal office fires, as it turns out, in the Twin Towers as well. Now, no office fire has ever brought down a skyscraper because these are steel-framed and fireproof skyscrapers, ever. And we have over 100 very large, very hot, and long-lasting fires in these steel-frame fireproof skyscrapers. So all of a sudden, the three worst structural failures in modern history occur on one day. And one of them, as you mentioned, wasn't hit by an airplane. So
what? I mean, okay. Let's stop for a second here. You're claiming, obviously, you're doubting what's going on. You're saying that they can't be hot enough to melt steel. Something else melted it. You're just, asking these questions as an architect. You think, who did this then?
Well, we'll get to that.
Okay. Because I'm very curious about that.
Because where did the molten metal come from? Dr. Stephen Jones, a physicist formerly from Brigham Young University, analyzes the molten metal, a 40-pound chunk sent to him. He finds that it has aluminum, iron. It's not steel because it has very little chromium. So we're not talking about melted structural steel. We're talking about molten iron, which is the byproduct of thermate.
Of what?
Thermate.
Thermate.
There's thermite and there's thermate. Thermate is with added sulfur, lowers the melting temperature of steel.
Sorry.
It's okay. The point is that he finds the chemical evidence of thermate, iron, aluminum, sulfur, and manganese and potassium, and fluorine as well, in the ends of the beams, which the first responders and ironworkers said were dripping with molten steel. He finds the evidence of this thermite cutter charge used by the military.
Okay, cutter charge. Now you're talking about something that's man-made. Let's get back to that right after this break. Possible man-made cutter charges, World Trade Center. We'll see right after this break. I'm back with Richard Gage. He's an architect. He's also the founder of Architects and Engineers for AE911Truth. You don't believe that this was possibly, these towers, the Twin Towers were brought down by these planes. Molten metal, you say, was present. Tell me about these cutter charges. Explain this.
Well, it turns out that all of the dust which blanketed lower Manhattan to 4 inches thick contains within it these iron-rich microspheres, billions of them, estimated to be in weight about 10 tons. And these are smaller than a human hair, most of them. Dr. Jones found them only 8-9 months ago. And they also have the chemical evidence of thermate. Well, how did they get formed? Well, if there were thousands of these cutter charges placed throughout the beams and columns in the building...
You're saying thousands of charges, thousands of little explosives?
Well, one would have to, in order to bring a building down by controlled demolition the size of the World Trade Center, for instance, it would take thousands.
So, okay, let's just assume, we'll go with the theory for a second. Thousands of cutter charges placed in this huge tower, probably, let's say, a team of 30 people planting these, taking maybe a month to work up into the girders to plant them. Is that what you're saying? Is something maybe like that happened?
That's a reasonable conclusion, yeah.
And one of these 30 people possibly that planted these charges, maybe more, 100 people to plant thousands of charges, have ever come forward and says, yeah, it was me, I planted the charges, I'm so sorry.
Well, guess what? You're a detective. You walk into a house, there's a dead body on the ground, 3 shell casings. Do you need to know who did it, how they did it, and have anybody talk before you're going to start with a fully resourced forensic investigation with subpoena power under oath? No, you're going to put everything you got on that case because you have evidence of a crime. This chemical evidence is evidence of a crime. These iron microspheres could only have been produced by molten iron under extreme pressure, forming themselves into a...
So this molten iron can't come from melted steel. Is that what you're saying?
Well, it's iron. No, it doesn't have chromium in it. Molten iron is the byproduct of thermite.
You didn't do well in chemistry, apparently. I don't know all the tables of the elements well. But anyways, you're the architect. And so you're saying that obviously something else brought these towers down. That's what you're assuming. Or at least what you're led to believe.
Oh, clearly. And not only the...
But 3,000 people died for what? Okay, what's the theory that you think, I mean, you probably don't want to comment on this, but do you think, okay, the U.S. government was behind this to generate a war, to get people mad about terrorism? What do you think?
I'll comment on that, but I want to point out some really critical evidence that we haven't talked about yet. There's not only these iron-rich microspheres that are the product of an aluminothermic reaction, thermite, we also have unexploded chips of thermite. These are red chips up to a 1/16 of an inch long. These are composed of nano-sized particles, extremely small. This stuff is not made in a cave in Afghanistan. We're talking about a very, very high-tech product that only in the last couple of years, Lawrence Livermore Lab and Los Alamos Lab have come out with papers on.
And you're saying only the U.S. government would have access, the U.S. military would have access to this stuff?
Well, let's say it this way. Al-Qaeda didn't have access to it. That's an unreasonable assumption. It's also unreasonable to suggest that Al-Qaeda had access to these buildings to plant these charges. These 3 buildings had to be among the most secure outside the Pentagon. Look at Building 7, for instance, the one which drops exactly in the manner of a controlled demolition at virtually free fall speed. To achieve that, you have to remove 40,000 tons of structural steel, starting with the core columns all within 1/10 of a second of each other, and then the 57 perimeter columns within 1/10 of a second of each other, and then repeat that every floor, synchronistically timed. So Al-Qaeda didn't have access to that building because it's operated by the CIA, IRS, Department of Defense, and several large financial institutions.
What about the Pentagon? What about that one? The plane goes into there. That's all part. Is that what was the design of that? How come they wouldn't blow up the whole Pentagon?
Well, I haven't studied the Pentagon.
Okay, so you're just talking about these twin towers, these 3 towers.
Well, let's look at the twin towers now, because what we're told is that there's structural weakening due to the airplanes. And by the way, these fires only lasted 56 minutes and 102 minutes. And fires have never brought buildings down that have lasted 18 hours, 24 hours over multiple floors, much hotter fires. So we're told that this 15-story section, for instance, above the jet plane impact, drove the rest of the building down at virtually free fall speed. Let's think about this for a minute.
Yeah.
Well, that's what we're told. And so let's take a 15-story building and hold it up over a 95-story building, right? Because we have 110 floors total. And we're going to hold it up with a crane.
Yeah.
And next to it, we're going to take a 15-story building, hold it up over nothing at all.
Right.
And we're going to pull with a crane, and we're going to pull the levers on these cranes. What happens? Which one's going to hit the ground first? The one without any resistance under it, or the one that has to crush 80,000 tons of structural steel? On 9/11, the physics was changed. We're told that they both hit the ground at the same time. That's where our USA tax dollars are going to. $20 million, 3 years of study in this NIST, which, by the way, this NIST report stops at the moment of initiation of collapse. It did not examine the behavior of the building after, they say, collapse initiation began.
So, I mean, you're saying you're giving scientific data, you got all this forensic evidence. When you present this stuff to people, to the 9/11 Commission, do they just go, I don't want to hear it, talk to the hand, I don't want to, like, what do they say when you talk about this stuff?
Yeah, there is a deafening silence from officials in this government on this subject, and that's why it is a national grassroots movement growing by millions every year. We've only talked about that much of the scientific data.
You got more cards,
so
clearly, yeah.
So, but the people who become aware of this, virtually every architect and engineer that we talk to and show the presentation to in Vancouver and Victoria this weekend, you'll see that 99% of them will agree with us and will disagree with the official story that fires were responsible for these collapses. That's how convincing the evidence is. We don't have to do a hard convincing job here. But people talk to each other.
Okay, we're going to keep going. We have one more segment, and I got some big questions about conspiracy behind this. Is this just a conspiracy, or is there some truth behind what Mr. Gage is saying right after the break? I'm back for one final segment with Richard Gage, the founder of Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth. You don't believe the story that's been told that it was the terrorists that flew in and that's how these things dropped. Okay, let me just stop for a second. If it is, as you say, that possibly the U.S. military was involved in setting these thousands of charges and destroying the building, For what reason? There's got to be a motive. Behind every crime, there's a motive. What's the motive?
Well, I first want to suggest that the architects and engineers for 911Truth, over 300 of us, are demanding a real investigation, and we're not conspiracy theorists. We bring forth the forensic science-based evidence, which can be seen on our website, AE911Truth.org.
What's the reason, though? Like, what's the motive?
A real investigation pointed at those who benefited.
So who would benefit from killing 3,000 of their own people?
Well, every major war in this country has been started by a false flag operation. Most of these have been declassified now. For instance, Vietnam War. There was no Gulf of Tonkin incident as described to us.
But that's over, if you're going to stage something, why wouldn't they stage a possible hijacking of a plane and have fake people that were tortured or something, U.S. citizens, and we got to go invade Iraq or something, rather than let's kill 3,000 of our own people?
Well, why did we invade Iraq? Was it because of weapons of mass destruction? No. Was it because of ties to Al-Qaeda? No. Everybody knows why the United States invaded Iraq. Now, people need to ask themselves the question, why are we in Afghanistan? Well, this isn't my primary area of research, but it's quite interesting to note that the Taliban was not negotiating with the United States relative to the oil and natural gas pipelines being brought down from the Turkmenistan, I believe it was, which was a pipeline plan to go to Pakistan. They were negotiating with a company in Brazil. And there was some threats, and those are very well documented by the U.S. government on the Taliban. Newsweek reported that the invasion of Afghanistan was signed by President Bush the day before 9/11, September 10th.
So again, the motive, I'm just trying to be clear because I'm just thinking as a normal crime, I go, oh, the person was angry or the person had a vendetta. You're saying the U.S. government and possibly military was involved in this because they're the only ones who have access to this kind of material, because they wanted to galvanize the people against the Middle East so they can get oil. Was that kind of what you're saying?
And I'm not saying that, but that's what a lot of people are saying.
But that's a possibility. Is that what you're saying?
Sure, it's a possibility. It's quite a possibility.
It seems like quite a stretch to do just to get some oil.
I think if people who do the research realize that this is a lot more about oil. The Project for a New American Century was a think tank composed of those neocons that are currently in power. What did their website say? They want to gain regional hegemony in the Middle East, increase the military budget by vast amounts, et cetera, et cetera.
But they can do all that.
Absent a catalyzing and catastrophic event like a new Pearl Harbor, these goals are not going to be reached very quickly. I'm paraphrasing.
Yeah.
But that is a heck of a statement and needs to be looked
you're
at.
right. I mean, disasters often produce a sense of a huge response. And you're saying maybe this disaster was used as a way to justify their response in both in Iraq and Afghanistan. However, I'm doubting this. I'm doubting the fact that something of this magnitude could be pulled off without one janitor, some guy who's being paid $8 an hour who says, hey, I can make $10 million on a story if I broke and said, I was the guy with the keys, let all the guys in to put the charges up.
Well, how long
it takes one guy to say that.
How long would your life last if you did say that, frankly? And what does the environment...
change my look, I'll grow a beard.
What is the environment in which, is there any receptivity in the mainstream media right now, which 90% of it in the United States is owned by 4 corporations? Who sits on those corporations, the boards of those corporations? The same people who sit on the boards of the defense industry, oil industry, banking industry, insurance industry. All those industries profited enormously from 9/11, and a real investigation will inevitably end up there. But can you doubt the physical, science-based forensic evidence that this is thermate, these cutter charges, that the laws of physics were violated on 9/11 with the collapse of all 3 of these towers against thousands of tons of structural steel at free fall speed? That there's evidence, chemical evidence in the molten metal, the World Trade Center dust and the ends of the slags of the beams, which are seen dripping with molten metal, which the official story can't even account for. That there's explosions occurring in the Twin Towers 20, 40, 60 stories below the collapse that have no possible explanation. These are pulverized building materials occurring at 160 to 200 feet per second. These are not puffs of air being produced by some air pressure where this building above is driving the rest of the building down.
That debris you're saying is an explosion. It's not just...
Oh, it's very clear in all the videos. You can see it.
It's so clear.
You know
how come like someone doesn't, some senator doesn't go, so clear to me too, we're doing an investigation. All the senators, everyone's in on this.
Yeah, well, there are a number of high-ranking government officials calling for a new investigation. For one reason, because we have 110 floors, each an acre in size. Guess how many are found at the bottom of the Twin Towers?
I don't know.
None. Not 50, not 20, not one floor. There's a
all
pile of, that's right, they've been completely pulverized, the concrete, 90,000 tons of it, to a fine dust, smaller than a human hair. There's only a pile of structural steel and aluminum cladding at the bottom of these towers.
Mr. Gage, we're right out of time. This is really fascinating. Clearly, there's so many questions that are unanswered on this issue of the 9/11. The issue to me, though, it's either you are right and possibly thousands of people who are in on this are wrong and they're hiding it and hope they come out and maybe our jails will be packed with people who are in part of this, this conspiracy or this issue. You have been really fascinating. Thanks for coming on our show tonight.